Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here as we continue to have people join our room here. Thank you for joining our Pennsylvania Budget Summit workshop. Thank you so much for joining. We will get started in just a minute, but I will introduce myself. My name is Katie Personette. I'm Deputy Director of Campaigns with Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Very happy to be with you all tonight. Today. I'm happy to start off this workshop and just a little bit about the workshop here. The workshop's titled Towards Racial Equity in Pennsylvania Public Policy. The workshop will examine the racial inequities that exist in Pennsylvania and the policy solutions that can advance equity in the Commonwealth. The workshop will be a panel discussion featuring members of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus. And just so you all know, after all panelists have concluded their presentation, we'll be reading and responding to questions submitted by attendees. You are invited to submit questions during the presentations via the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen on the WOVA app. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please indicate which one. If you are having technical issues, please send us a message using the app or the WOVA app chat feature, not the Q&A tool. The Q&A tool will specifically be for questions and answers. So again, welcome. If you're just joining us, you are in hopefully the correct place. This is the Budget Summit workshop titled Towards Racial Equity in Pennsylvania Public Policy. So happy to have you with us. So we'll just get started here. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Very excited to be joined here by both State Representative Donna Bullock and State Representative Napoleon Nelson. State Representative Donna Bullock out of Philadelphia is a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, representing the 195th Legislative District in North and West Philadelphia. She has represented the district since 2015. She chairs the Legislative Black Caucus as a champion in the House for a Pennsylvania that works for all of us. She and Representative Napoleon Nelson are leading an effort to create an agenda that addresses deeply seated racial inequities in our social and government systems in the Commonwealth. State Representative Napoleon Nelson was elected to represent the 154th Legislative District in November 2020, so newly elected. A native of Philadelphia's Mount Airy neighborhood, Napoleon moved to Cheltenham in 2003. He is leading the charge in the legislature to rethink our policies that deepen inequity and sits on several critical committees in the legislature, including aging, children, and youth, education, and finance. So again, welcome to our workshop. Very happy to have you all, and let's get down to it. I will now turn it over to our panelists to begin.
Thank you, Katie, for that warm introduction, and thank you to the entire team at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. It is truly a great day to be able to share some of the work that the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus has been working on, and I'm going to shortly share my screen with you. But I wanted to just say, as we started to embark on a budget conversation this year, we did it in the context of what our country was facing with the pandemic and the economic crisis, and really a reckoning with racial inequities and injustice in our country. And knowing that, we said to ourselves, there is no way that we can allow the amount of resources and funding and programs that are going to happen to address our economic crisis and the pandemic. We cannot allow those things to happen. We cannot allow these funds to be invested and for programs and services to be delivered in the same ways and in the same structures that had created the disparities in the past, and the disparities that we're still seeing today. And so with that, I want to start by sharing my screen and talk a little bit about the Black Caucus and who we are. So again, definitely an honor to be here today to talk to you about our efforts towards racial equity using public policy in the budget as a tool. The Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus provides legislative, administrative, and other supportive services to our members and their staff. We aim to make sure that our members are strong and effective here in the Commonwealth, in the capital, as well as in their individual districts. We stand at 30 members, more than 30 members of color, and other associate members who represent districts of color. We also work to advance and sometimes defeat legislation and policy that may impact communities of color, and work to advance legislation that creates equitable access to opportunities, justice, and democracy.
Representative Bullock, I don't think we're hearing anything.
Okay, can't hear it. I know why. Let me go back. We'll get there.
I think the Black Caucus has been a tremendous improvement here in Harrisburg.
I stand tonight as a freedom fighter for those persons who cannot fight for themselves.
I am standing with my people, my friends, my family.
Y'all got the power.
The only way we move forward as a community and as a people is if we take care of ourselves.
We have the power to change it.
Help us to foster a better tomorrow.
It is only in tomorrow that the promises of today can be realized.
So thank you for indulging me as I share just a little bit of history of the Black Caucus. And as I mentioned, we work to support legislation and policies that uplifts our communities, that really, when we look at legislation, we want to look at legislation that addresses systemic racism, economic disparities, and we've been talking a lot about making sure we're including the voices of communities of color, including them in the legislation that we're working on, seeking their input, seeking their guidance as we move forward. Oftentimes we see legislation come before us and we see a list of stakeholders, and many times that list of stakeholders does not include communities of color or groups that represent them. And lastly, which I think is relative to today's topic, we're always looking at legislation and policy that we believe invest in our communities, our families, and our businesses. A lot of folks ask me, well, what is the Black Caucus's agenda? What are you looking at? And it's really hard for me to say, this is the exact bill we're looking to promote this year. This is the exact piece of legislation that the Black Caucus is endorsing, because what we also know is our communities of color are diverse. Our opinions are diverse. How we feel about specific legislation may may differ in many ways. We're not monolithic in that sense, but there are definitely areas in which we focus. There are areas where we look at how can we eliminate disparities or create opportunities. I list sort of broad stroke areas here: civil and voting rights, criminal justice and prison reform, economic empowerment and security, education, housing, healthcare, environmental justice, and police reform and public safety. I just looked at a chart to see where were most of our Black Caucus members' policy legislation being referred, what committees. So overwhelmingly, the legislation that we were introducing in the last session was being referred to the Judiciary Committee. So we focus a lot, my members individually and collectively focus a lot on criminal justice and prison reform, police reform, and other issues that will fall into that particular category. Second would be education. And then third was state government. So that would be issues around voting rights and such. And so we can see that there are definitely focus areas in which the Black Caucus focuses on. This year, we created several subcommittees to work on issues that are important to us: voting and democracy, women and girls of color, health equity and justice, gun violence and public safety, education, and lastly, budget equity, in which Rep. Napoleon Nelson is the chair of. And as you can see, a lot of those subcommittees mirror the buckets of legislation that we work on. So why budget equity? Why did we decide that this was the year for us to talk about budget equity? Well, we believe that budgets can be a tool for racial equity, and that if you really want to end systemic racism, it requires an investment in systemic equity and justice. And more than anything, the time is now. And if you would indulge me for yet another video. After a year of a pandemic, an economic crisis, police violence, and universal recognition of institutional racism, Black Pennsylvanians and other communities of color are looking to Harrisburg for answers.
The members of the Legislative Black Caucus are putting forth this letter to the governor with every expectation that we want to be clear, we want to be intentional about our request that the governor speak to equity. He speaks in his budget address to the many concerns and the many ills that have plagued communities of color and underserved communities throughout this Commonwealth, and have been plaguing those communities not since the pandemic started, but they have been plaguing those communities for years.
Budgets are not colorblind. How we deliver services, how we distribute resources, how we raise revenues, and how we fill budget shortfalls often disproportionately impact communities of color. We hope that Governor Wolf and our General Assembly colleagues use the budget as a tool to address these racial inequities.
We can no longer accept budgeting as a way of replicating what we did last year or what we intended to do the year before. We need to think about budgets, and we need to think about how the state is utilizing its resources going forward in a way that really takes that long, hard look at the status of our community and considers how we make sure that going forward, that our tomorrows aren't going to look just as our yesterdays did, because for too many of us, our yesterdays were bleak.
And we look forward to working with them to take this step towards racial equality, racial equity, and healing in our Commonwealth. That starts with a budget that is a measure of our priorities. Okay, I promise I won't play any more videos, but I thought that some of those videos helped illustrate where we were. So how did we get here? Why are we talking about budget equity today? Reality is that for a long time, and pretty much for this country's entire history, we have had bias and racist fiscal policies and investments that created these disparities, right? In many ways, the way that our country was established, the way that it has prospered, has been often on the backs of free labor, slave labor, and on other racist policies that have created long-standing disparities and inequities in our country. And we haven't really taken the kind of steps that we could take to adjust some of those disparities. We can look at transportation and infrastructure. Even in that space, we have had transportation policies that have created segregated neighborhoods, that have isolated and separated communities of color from opportunities, from good jobs, great schools, cut them off from services and other resources, furthering some of the inequities that we see, and creating isolated communities without grocery stores, without banks, without all of the resources that help build wealth, that help build sustainability in a community. And our government invested in that. Our government, our state and federal governments invested in these policies that continued even through, I would say, through today. Housing development. We've all heard about redlining. But it wasn't just redlining. We had segregated public housing under the Roosevelt administration, which that was the liberal view, because honestly, the conservative view was no public housing for Blacks, period. But if, we had it, it was segregated public housing to, maintain somewhat the status quo of those communities and the culture of already existing segregated communities. And we also know about all of the housing vouchers and systems and incentives and loans that were available to white communities to build white suburbia that were not available for Black communities and Black families. This created a very much segregated and unequal housing development policy here in our country. Agriculture. I mean, Pennsylvania's #1 industry is agriculture, but historically we can say, and we know, agriculture in this country and in this state was built on stolen land and stolen labor, and benefited those families and companies that today still stand because of their agricultural roots and the wealth that they've built during this time. We are seeing now a lot of efforts to support Black farmers. Promises that were made to Black farmers years and years that have never been fulfilled, and now we're seeing efforts to do that. We're also looking at how can we support migrant farm workers, mostly of Latino descent. How can we help them build opportunities to become owners of those agricultural businesses and not just workers? How can we subsidize their opportunity for business ownership in that space? Education, conversation I think many of us are familiar with, but we can talk over and over and have a whole nother segment about fair funding formulas here in Pennsylvania. We can talk about the historic disparities of separate but equal education in this country. We can talk about what that looks like today, and to continue in the various policies that exist, whether it's supporting public schools, traditional public schools, charter public schools, parochial schools, and school choice. And what does that look like for Black and Brown communities? And even within each of those spaces, if you were just to look at how we support public charter schools, you will see discrepancies even just looking at those schools, where Black-led charter schools are struggling a bit more with finding resources or support, or even garnering support from the private foundation space to support those Black-led charter schools that serve predominantly Black communities. And lastly, we can talk about small businesses. Again, another space in which Black and Brown owned small businesses are locked out from opportunities to get loans and finance support from our financial institutions, but also are locked out of grant opportunities that are supported by our state and local and even federal governments through the SBA and other programs. So, if we want to really talk about racial inequities, we have to talk about the investments we made over decades to create these disparities. And as an influx of federal dollars moves into our states and our local governments, we cannot allow for those dollars to be used in a way that creates even more or widens the existing disparities. So for us as a Black caucus, we believe, and we are moving forward with this notion that our budget is a tool for racial equity. It is a tool that we can use to balance some of those disparities that I've talked about. And we should really take a really strategic approach at working through our budget. I am so happy that I have Rep. Nelson working with me on this, because he's the numbers guy. He gets all of these money issues in a way that and helps me see it as, because I'm not that numbers person so much. I'm the big picture person. But we can use our budget as an asset management approach to achieve more equitable services, right? Our budget is an asset, and those dollars are our dollars as taxpayers, and we should make sure that it's being used in a way that benefits and uplifts all Pennsylvanians, and specifically invest in ways to end racial inequities, but invest specifically in racial equity or other equities as well. We should be intentional about that, as Rep. Nelson mentioned in the video, tracking and reporting service levels and investments by community and geography, because those are sometimes an issue around equity here in the Commonwealth. We should assess those reports and look at the impacts of our budget requests. One of the things that one of the pieces of legislation I'm introducing is the creation of a joint legislative committee on equity. We get a fiscal impact report on every piece of legislation that is introduced, but we don't get an equity impact report on legislation. How does this legislation, any proposed legislation, impact certain communities? How does it impact certain geographies of the Commonwealth? How does it impact men versus women? And just as we want to know how legislation may impact our budget, we should also have an understanding how it may impact communities across the Commonwealth. And we should include impact in our include those who are impacted and include them early in the process. You know, there are some pilot projects happening across the country around participatory budgeting, allowing communities to have direct input and decision-making power over what happens over maybe a small portion of a budget. You can say for, you know, if you're looking at a school community, you know, giving the students, for example, $10,000 to decide how they will use that to improve their schools. If you're looking at a city, allowing them to decide, you know, a certain portion of the budget that can be used for recreation centers, how will they use it in those recreation centers, and taking that input and using it to guide the budget process. We at the Black Caucus thinks that it is important to include our community and include the voices of others in the budgeting process. And so we are hosting our own budget information and listening session next week. That will be on Tuesday. We have a very limited number of speaking slots available for public comment, but we welcome those who are interested in speaking specifically about budget priorities for communities of color. We invite you to come and register and speak next week. We will be joined by Secretary Jen Swales, and this event will be hosted by myself and Rep. Nelson. You know, I'm really happy to be here today. And with that, I will pass the Zoom mic to my colleague, Rep. Nelson, who can share some more about the work that we're doing and about the current budget proposal and how the Black Caucus is working to advance certain initiatives in that proposal. Rep. Nelson.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. And I will say through this, I'll try and have a couple spaces here where we can stop and make sure that we field any questions that are pertinent. I do also have a couple slides that I will share. But if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And perhaps as we're now kind of 20 minutes into this, this may be a good one. Levana, Katie, any of you guys want to handle, see if there are any questions before we start diving into kind of the budget equity portion here?
Representative Nelson, we do not have any questions as of right now, so we will let people know. This is a good opportunity to let people know that if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A on the Whova app, and we will come back at the end and address them. So if you're thinking of things now, feel free to put those in, and we'll come back and answer them at the end.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
All right. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, and I will jump in here. Figure out how to share. All right. So again, thank you guys, and thank you for your interest in this. I know that we aren't the first ones to talk with many of you around the budget this year. in the governor's budget proposal. I will try and highlight just a little bit here on the process, or at least some of the timing that will get us from when this work started, not the budget equity subcommittee, but just the state's budget and kind of when it's hopeful to end. But I will first just jump into, as was mentioned, right? So we started with sending a letter from the Legislative Black Caucus to the governor that just talked about the need for equity and the need for budget equity. And some of this was kind of discussed already and introduced with Chairwoman Bullock. So I'll keep this here as we get into it. Going forward, the hope and the goal is that we always make sure that our dollars are matching our values. That as the state continues to advance, and hopefully even locally, as local communities continue to advance their budgets, their spend plans for the next year or years, that within those budgets, you can get a real sense for the values of that community. And to some degree, and as particularly as it pertains to this work that we're talking about now from an equity perspective, some of those values ought to be based in the history that that community has already kind of experienced and has imparted on those within the community. From an equity perspective, we're not just looking at where are there perhaps differences in outcomes or discrepancies in current state. Just from a statistical perspective, a lot of the work that we're trying to do within this subcommittee is also looking at and why, like if there is a good reason why those discrepancies exist, if there is something that's systemically or institutionally kind of built that suggests that, yes, we're going to have a problem and that problem will persist going forward without corrective action, that's where this lens towards equity is really, really important. That's where the work of not equality, right? Equalities perhaps might suggest, okay, you know, as was mentioned, redlining, and we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But if you've had a history where we understand and we had codified, you know, kind of discriminatory lending practices, well, doing away with discriminatory lending practices doesn't now put all communities and all individuals within our commonwealth on level footing. What we'll see, and what I'll hopefully try and impart, is the discrepancies in kind of household wealth that perhaps were born after years and years of discriminatory practice now make equality still very discriminatory. And so the investment in equity is so heavily important. And we'll see that in all of these many lenses. So we started this with a letter to the governor on January 19th. From a timelines perspective, from the state's budgets, just kind of crash course, the governor will present his budget to the general legislative body, generally at the very beginning of February. And so for us, we wanted to try and just kind of give the governor a heads up at the end of January to say, here's what we within the Legislative Black Caucus is looking for. It was a little bit longer of a letter than this. We certainly have that on the websites, and we'll be happy to share that with you. But what the governor then does, the governor will present his or her budget to the legislature, and it then will kind of act as the kicking off point for what will then follow in the month of February into March, the beginning of March, of an awful lot of fairly in-depth budget hearings. Each of the many departments will generally appear in front of the appropriations committees on the House or the Senate side, explain their budgets, will be kind of grilled and questioned by members of those appropriations committees, and whichever of the appropriate House or Senate legislative committees kind of sit and provide some insight and oversight. And then we get to this portion where we are now, which is where that budget will continue to kind of take shape through the governor's office, through the two committees, through leadership within the House and Senate. The anticipation is that a budget will be finalized before the end of June. So we now have another couple months here where We will continue to, on our end, from the Legislative Black Caucus's perspective, continue to kind of digest what is in the governor's budget, what was presented to those committees in that appropriations hearings. That again was a good 3+ weeks in the House side, another couple of days on the Senate side. And then all of this information will be kind of coalesced and then presented out to you. So our subcommittee was tasked with advancing this work. I think this has kind of been touched on already. So we talked again about the governor's budget address, this appropriations process where members of the Legislative Black Caucus were really front and center in that work during that appropriations hearing. Our chairwoman Bullock herself was just fearless. And so we're really very much appreciative of their leadership and of the voice that our Legislative Black Caucus has within that appropriations committee. Where we are now is we are in this kind of lens of public feedback. So what we'll talk about for the next, I guess, about 45 minutes will be a bit of what we're looking at and how we are responding to the governor's budget, but also really what is important for us in this time, this end of March, April, and perhaps even into the May phase, is hearing from you all. The work that we are able to kind of impart to you, the insights that we can impart regarding here's what's in the budget if you haven't heard. And then very importantly, as you all, as crucial stakeholders, as crucial community leaders are able to kind of communicate back to us those points of interest, we can make sure that, as I always say, that we're fighting for the right things. And so we'll talk just a little bit about that. In the end, from a Legislative Black Caucus Budget Equity Subcommittee, I've kind of tasked myself, hopefully, and us, those who are helping out in this effort, with publishing a final report. We'll see what this looks like. And most importantly, perhaps most importantly, from a Legislative Black Caucus's perspective, developing a process that we will be able to replicate and improve upon going forward. This has been just kind of a wonderfully monumental lift that we've embarked on in the past couple months. And I certainly know that I'm just continuing to build on this process, continuing to follow this leadership that we've kind of been provided for, will only improve as we get into future years of this process. So thank you all for being a part of it. And I have to kind of put a final asterisk by that last item at the bottom, which is COVID-19. And recently, obviously, the funding that we've received from Washington has thrown a wonderful wrench into the process. So we now have within the state the responsibility in many ways of ensuring that we appropriate significant dollars. Over the past year, this has been the case. We have had this responsibility to appropriate and have advocated in doing so equitably, and doing so, in fact, looking at those kind of within the BIPOC communities from a housing perspective, from an investment in minority businesses, to make sure that those who are hit hardest are able to not only respond and be able to advance forward, given what will be a very challenging recovery. This is an equitable approach, right? So as we think about, for example, how we are supporting those within the hospitality industry, because hospitality throughout the Commonwealth, throughout the country, has really taken a very hard hit. That's an equitable approach to how we think about small business. Well, again, how we think about those within the BIPOC communities as they need to recover and respond from COVID, and from all the rest of what has been placed on BIPOC communities in this nation's history, is again a very equitable approach to how we are enacting this budget, how we are spending dollars. So let me dive into it. The work that we've got so far, and I give credit to this to Rep. Morgan Cephas, who is just another phenomenal leader within the Legislative Black Caucus. I have been absolutely blessed in these first couple of months to have some amazing leaders who've been really helping to contribute to this work. What we're focusing on is just kind of a comprehensive investment. I'm continuing to use the phrase, and what we will see going forward is we are focusing on an investment in wealth, health, education, and justice reforms, right? Wealth, health, education, and justice reforms, because those are so vitally important to a community, community that has been disparaged over the many years, and it's so vital to how we will be able to move forward. You kind of can't do much of anything in a very sustainable way without doing all of them, right? So you can't try and put education forward if you don't also address, health disparities, if you don't understand the income disparities, and if obviously there isn't a justice system that makes sense. So trying to make sure that we are looking at, current situation, current status in Pennsylvania, the governor's budget, and then advocating for various investments in BIPOC communities as we attack inequities in wealth, health, education, and justice. So from a health perspective, these are very well known as the social determinants of health, but it actually plays itself out in all of these various areas. So what was in, I'm sorry, before I say what was in the budget. So when we look at wealth equity, for example, the histories of inequities from a wealth perspective are, well known. This is, none of what I'm going to show is going to be a comprehensive list, right? But I mean, I don't need to go too deep into slavery, in the equitable distribution of benefits from the GI Bill, right? So African-American soldiers returning from war weren't really given access to the rights and the benefits codified to all soldiers, quote unquote, as they returned home. Just significant histories of employment and wage discrimination. And again, as we mentioned, kind of redlining and other lending discriminations. And I put these in here because for many, this is within our lifetime. Slavery, perhaps not so much, but much of this work, much of these impacts, much of this discrimination is within our lifetimes. And therefore, what you'll see then is that inability to generate wealth. Those who are living in poverty, you don't have the opportunity to pass along wealth to future generations, right? We understand just the intergenerational impacts that poverty has on that next generation. You don't have more to pass along. Similarly, the inability to generate wealth means that there's housing insecurity, there's food insecurities. Most will use kind of that basic housing as the launching pad for entrepreneurial investments, for educational pursuits and higher educational attainment. So what we want to make sure we are doing and putting a lens on is, how is the governor's budget and how does the state's budget invest in trying to right inequities from a wealth perspective, right? So the governor's budget, by the way, it was a pretty wonderfully progressive budget proposal that the governor put out. We're so supportive of him in that effort. I'd love to make sure that, to join him on the campaign trail, quote unquote, as he touts the budget, opportunities that he has. But so he's got some great items that you've probably already heard of. Again, the reforms to the personal income tax to both raise the rates, but also establish exemptions based on levels of or multiplications of poverty. So I think it's significantly moves the bar on those who will perhaps pay less to the same amount of income tax in the state, but also identifying those who have and ensuring that they're paying a fair share to make sure that the government is able to fund itself and its operations. He's placed in here things like a $1 million investment in Shift, which is one of my favorites that I've identified throughout the work here. It's a pilot program to reduce the number of children who perhaps are taken from their homes and kind of thrust into our social service system based on housing insecurity of that family. These are families that are in place, but because of housing insecurity, you end up looking at foster care situations and other kind of congregate care. Certainly, raising the minimum wage is wonderfully important as we understand and try and attack wealth and inequities in our system. This is crucial. And so hopefully all of you all are as vocal as we are in supporting this push to increase the minimum wage. But also there are some loopholes that governor is proposing to close corporate tax reforms, corporate tax loopholes. So many who perhaps may operate a business in multiple states, we aren't able to identify the incomes that they, or appropriately tax the incomes here in Pennsylvania because of loopholes that allow them to go and allocate all of those funds in like Delaware or out of state. So there's some combined reporting that you may hear. And then there are other items that are very important, like the legalization of adult use recreational marijuana and ensuring an equitable distribution of industry opportunity that comes from that, right? So it's not just enough to ensure that we are able to legalize adult use recreational marijuana, but, and this will show up later as we talk about justice equity, we want to make sure that there is an equitable distribution of industry opportunity, right? So make sure that as jobs are being created, as wealth is being created in a new industry, that it's done so not only with an understanding of those communities that have been negatively impacted by our current stance on marijuana, but those communities that also have the opportunity to grow into this new industry. And finally, the governor's work, the governor's budget includes a fairly, I'll call it a broad back to work PA plan. So again, many investments in here. This is by no means the comprehensive list of what the governor has proposed in his budget that perhaps has some lens on how we can try and impact equities, try and attack poverty in our communities. But this is a decent list of some of the highlights that I'll point out. And then within the Legislative Black Caucus, again, we don't have, I'm sorry. So the Legislative Black Caucus doesn't have, for example, a platform, but I'll call it the Legislative Black Caucus interest points may include, again, certainly fighting for a minimum wage increase. Other items that have been approached, and Rep. Bullock talked about some of the legislation that reps have already put forth and put onto the floor. Rep. Austin Davis out of kind of the Allegheny area has put together a couple great bills, one on establishing a wage board for direct care workers. I think wage boards for child and direct care workers is probably wonderfully appropriate. These are individuals who generally work in industries that most of their or much of their funds are reimbursed or reimbursed from federal and state funds. These are small businesses that are probably not on their way out. So we can identify and try and instruct the work quality, the working conditions, and the wages. Investment in affordable and public housing. So part of this is what we see in the SHIFT program, but there is still, as we are looking at wealth inequalities, there is still a significant waiting list of folks who have been waiting to get into affordable housing options. There is still a significant number of folks, veterans included, who are really struggling with housing insecurities, and it impacts us at all ages and all levels. Another Austin Davis bill is one that establishes kind of a program for low-income residents to help support them from a wastewater and a water infrastructure program for their home heating, their home water and wastewater billing. Again, another major investment for us is to support our CDFIs. These are our kind of community financial institutions that are heavily able to support and invest in minority businesses frequently. This is so crucial to continuing to not only recover from COVID, but continue to build sustainable community and economic activity. And then again, as Rep. Bullock mentioned, ensuring that there is a path to sustainable funding for public transportation. Public transportation has been hit very, very hard during this pandemic, and it's something that we really need to make sure that we're working on. So that's a wealth perspective. I think now is hopefully a good time to also stop and ask for questions on that.
So we do have two questions. And just to briefly introduce myself, since I wasn't in the beginning, this is Levana Layendecker. I'm the Associate Director with the PA Budget and Policy Center. I think I'm going to start with a question that I think directly speaks to what you are talking about with wealth inequity from Carlene. She asks, how can we use racial equity to support Black kids in predominantly white schools? Here in State College, Black students make up only 2.5% of the population, but they're failing at the highest rate. Starting a pre-K program may help close the achievement or opportunity gap.
Absolutely. So when we get to the education portion, that'll absolutely show up because yes, pre-K gaps are significant. And, before coming into Harrisburg, I was on my local school board here in Cheltenham. And, we talk an awful lot about achievement gaps and gaps in academic attainment based perhaps on zip code, or based more importantly on what we generally identify as those kind of historically underperforming factors. So if you're in a community of color, if you're under oftentimes that achievement gap is greatest in kindergarten and first grade. So one of the areas that certainly the governor has put some more funding behind is continuing to expand, and he's been great in his tenure in ensuring that we are building this infrastructure of full-time kindergarten and pre-kindergarten programming. And again, dollars are being directed and funded into our pre-K programs. That is very important, we believe. He's also continuing to invest in special education. Unfortunately, oftentimes our school districts have kind of had students who have identified with special education needs. And while we do track academic performance and achievement gaps, there is a significant problem in how we are able to get students who present with a disability, students who have an individualized education plan, with getting to the same expectations and standards that we have for those who don't present with those same disabilities, with getting the adequate education that we're looking for. I may have stumbled through that, but it's a great question. It is a vital question, and I think a lot of what we'll talk about from an education perspective will help to hit on those. So if the education portion doesn't answer that question, please make sure you ask that again.
We had one other question, which I will start it now. And if people have questions, you should go ahead and put them in the Q&A on the Whova app. So Jordy, who is a friend of the org and works with the Hub Project, asks, as a rural organizer, we want to build power that's aligned with equity. At the same time, it seems that we need ways to message this to build multiracial durable coalitions. They are using the race class narrative, and wondering if you all are familiar with that and are using it, and how do you build support in ways that undo the embedded racist dog whistling that's, I assume, means part of the rhetoric.
That's a great question. I'll jump in. I think, we can all do better about narratives and framing, which is why it's somewhat difficult sometimes for us to move legislation across the line, is the narrative. And in the reality, as you mentioned, many of the issues that communities of color are facing are the same issues we see in our rural communities as well. Their schools are underfunded. They have lack of access to healthcare. The industries in those communities are struggling. So if we can find ways to find those parallels, find ways to have those conversations to show how, if you lift up, the boats of Black folks of color, your boat will get lifted too, right? How we all can ride this wave together. And I think that's a conversation that we should definitely have. And I look forward to perhaps having some conversations with you to build those alliances with our rural communities in the Commonwealth.
Sorry, I just want to correct that Jordy works with the Hub for Progress, not the Hub. They're two separate things. But thank you, Representative Bullock. And it is something that we are also working on at the PA Budget and Policy Center. And how do we frame our policy work in a way that has that broad, durable appeal, but also still talks about the racial inequities that exist. And I just want to note that even in rural communities where there are small populations of people of color, which is not all rural communities, but some, we find those disparities still exist, even if they're just a very small part of the population. So I think that it's, critical that we really make sure to address this everywhere and with all constituents. So thank you. So those are the questions we have for now. I'll let you get back to it. And if there are more questions, I'll bubble them up.
Sure. All right. So I talk a bit about, again, wealth, health, education, and justice reform, right? And we talked about just kind of the comprehensive investment, the social determinants. So we'll talk a little bit more about now health and what that looks like. I'm kind of bolding or highlighting a couple areas here because these are, I appreciate that I'm giving you more text than just kind of the bullets that I gave you the last time. But again, health equity is one of the really difficult items within the community, the African-American communities, communities of color. We see it right now, for example, as you're looking at statistics on COVID vaccinations. There's a significant narrative and much of it perhaps is a little bit overblown regarding hesitation within the African-American and minority communities to request and seek the vaccine. There is significant understanding of comorbidities that those communities of color are dealing with. The virus itself is impacting those minority communities in a greater way than it is in other communities. And some of this is kind of just that overall, the social, determinants of health, right? So some of it is just stress, some of it is the environments that they're living in, but some of it is just kind of good old-fashioned health concerns that we're dealing with. So part of what we're trying to address here are just, the areas where historically there has been kind of institutionalized, mistreatment and concerns within those communities of color. And so I point out things like the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks. We look at the treatment of oftentimes African Americans and their doctors, and how there are some significant disparities in health outcomes, oftentimes because it almost seems like they're talking two different languages. You can look at this and say, well, there's some challenges here in that there aren't nearly an adequate representation of medical professionals of color to address the population that's seeking care. There are some just lack of understanding of how we approach and communicate with our doctors. There's some work that needs to happen within those communities of color. There's an awful lot of work that needs to happen within those medical schools and within the medical profession. But what it boils down to is, because of all of this history and because of these really established kind of practices and malpractices, there becomes this lack of trust and a significant lack of trust in the health system. And in fact, there was a wonderful report that, as we were getting started, that Chairwoman Bullock forwarded to me that helped to highlight in a portion of the state, in the western portion of the state, it's a really bad idea from a health perspective to be an African-American woman, because the realities of how African-American women are treated from an education perspective, from a healthcare perspective, certainly from a maternal health perspective, statistically, it is, there are some significant failings in our system and in our institutions. And so we're looking forward to continuing to make this call for reforms. The governor's office does make a couple of those, and there will be more that the wonderful champions within the House will continue to put forward. Please do look forward to more conversations around health equity, maternal health, and the plagues that are impacting our community. There are also other areas where, just from an environmental perspective, our communities have been subject to environmental injustices and kind of environmental racism that have really impacted. And it's not just the communities of color, it's low income and communities of color, but it's significant. One of my colleagues, Rep Parker, will consistently tell us her district, which is in kind of Germantown and a portion of North Philly, has perhaps one of the highest rates of asthma in the Commonwealth. And it's just because of the quality or poor quality of environmental, just the air, what's in the the soil, how our water is treated. We have some significant environmental injustices that are also attributing to lack of quality health within our communities. And then finally, part of it is, and I try not to spend too much time on the intersection between wealth, education, and health and the three, but certainly from a dietary perspective, having and living in food deserts really significantly impacts the quality of health of those within those communities. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing those. The governor's budget is again looking to invest significant portions into the Redevelopment Assistance Capital Program, or RACP. You'll hear me call this RACP going forward, which will not only work to remediate and help improve our schools and our schooling infrastructure. It would also help with broadband, and we'll perhaps get to that a little bit more. He's investing significant dollars in our kind of the community hospital programs, in our county health departments, as well as working to again continue to push RGGI and an approach to how we're managing greenhouse gases to make sure that the environments around us are better. And again, from a food perspective, another highlight here is $1 million in the PASS program to help improve food security and support farmers. So that's dollars that it's kind of subsidies to farmers to ensure that kind of their products are able to go directly into food pantries throughout the Commonwealth. So very important programs that can continue to really improve the quality of food that exists in our communities. Again, the Legislative Black Caucus interests on top of that, and sometimes also compensated or partnering with that, are requiring implicit bias training for health professionals. An expansion of kind of the Medicaid for 1 year postpartum again, and in fact, we just voted on this in our Committee for Children and Youth on Wednesday, understanding the impact of kind of postpartum depression on not just the mother, but on the mother, child, and family, and in trying to ensure that that entire family unit is able to get the support services that they need postpartum. So important. The governor is leading on this. We are all moving with this understanding here. So I think there's some really great work from a bipartisan perspective that can continue to make many of these happen. So again, reimbursement for doula services. As many women within our communities are looking for, where can we find the health access that we feel is responsive? Again, investing in those trusted health partners. Doula services are crucial. Environmental remediation for schools, also environmental remediation for senior living facilities and communities are also a major portion of that kind of health equity ask that the Legislative Black Caucus is looking into. I mentioned again, our interests include, because this is where we want to make sure we get that feedback from you. So continue to not only ask questions, but engage with us. And, did you think about this? Are you looking into that? And we really would advocate that you fight for the other things. So please do make sure that as I go through these lists and as I continue to highlight some of the work that we've got, many of the bills that are already being introduced by members of the Legislative Black Caucus, that you will continue to engage with us in that work. All right. So again, wealth, health, education, and justice. So there's an awful lot that was done in the governor's budget regarding education. We can talk about historically why it's so important to look at education from an equity perspective. And in fact, we're really excited that the Department of Education has kind of an education equity task force. In fact, the Department of Health has a health equity department as well, which we're really excited, or a health equity office. But so some of the history is there, and I'm not going to get too deep into this because you get it. Segregated schools, just lack of access to higher education. In our infrastructure right now from a facilities perspective, not just in Philadelphia, but across the state, is really challenging. In my district, in Cheltenham, Jenkintown, and Springfield, we've invested in some wonderful schools, some new beautiful schools. There are schools in some of our urban cores that are they seem to be built to last. They're still kind of standing strong at 150 years, but they're 100-year-old schools is not an equitable approach to education. And the failings that exist from a physical perspective in 100-year-old schools does not lend itself to being able to respond appropriately to changing educational and pedagogical improvements, but it also doesn't allow you to respond appropriately to what you see from it once that environmental collapse happens, once that pandemic hits, and even just as we understand more about play space and ensuring that we have adequate and green play space. There's just such a need for investment in facilities within our education system. And so the governor's budget includes fair funding, right? So it's a push first and foremost to have all of the block grant. This is the big dollar amount, $7 billion plus that the state spends on public education. It's not the local tax burden of education, but it's the rest of the dollars that come from the state, ensuring that all of that goes through the fair funding formula. This is kind of the headline of the governor's budget. This would yield significant investments in many of our school districts within kind of the Legislative Black Caucus catchments, but not all. It really begins to chip away at those school districts that really suffer from kind of the hold harmless or the hold harmed situation, where the state has historically underfunded from a understanding of adequate funding, underfunded those schools from those that have really been on the winning side of that. I suspect that you guys have gone through this conversation several times before, so I'm not going to get too deep into that, but if you have questions, please let us know. But at the same time, as he's pushing funds through that fair funding formula, the governor is calling for an additional $1.15 billion so that no school district experiences funding cuts, right? So this is to help ensure that those who would lose out once we pushed funds through the fair funding formula are then made whole again. So it's fair funding for all, while no districts experience funding cuts. There's additional dollars for charter reform, or additional calls for charter funding reform, funding again for pre-K programs, funding for special education programs, significant investment in RACP funds for educational institutions, as well as broadband, because this is a major issue within many of our communities, is access, particularly as we experienced through COVID, access to distance learning, sync and asynchronous learning is very challenging if we don't have adequate broadband access in our urban cores as well as in our rural areas. Again, additional interests, not a platform, but additional interests of the Legislative Black Caucus. Certainly, we continue to highlight that school funding. We highlight the facility needs of many of our school districts. I also highlight here the Education Dream Act. So this is one of those areas where there's a significant need for those who are undocumented immigrants, and many within our Legislative Black Caucus catchment will fall into that space. When we're looking at equity, you can understand that that undocumented immigrant population perhaps would fall in that space where oftentimes they are asking, and what we're looking for is the opportunity for those students who are in our communities to be able to go to our institutions of higher ed or our community colleges and pay the tuition that would be due based on their address, which right now many are able to do, but some aren't. But also access the appropriate state, kind of financial aid that is offered to students for, subsidizing and offsetting that cost of local tuition for our community colleges and our PASHE school system. So an Education Dream Act is also one of those interest areas. Again, broadband everywhere is significant, as well as pipelines for more educator diversity, because this is one of those major areas, very similar to health equity, where lacking diverse and lacking, educators who can look like, speak like, and relate to the students in front of them is so crucial. I think at this point, as I get into then the justice perspective, perhaps again, we've gone through health and education. Any more questions, Levana?
I don't have any questions for you right now.
Wonderful.
So move forward.
And hopefully I answered that initial question of how can we continue to help. There are some significant investments both in this budget and that we'll continue to talk to around how we can engage and continue to advance learners of color who are on kind of that downside, not able to access the educational opportunities that we believe all Pennsylvanians should have. From a justice perspective, again, communities of color have been constitutionally disenfranchised for unfortunately, still the majority of this nation's history. And then, following that, we've had Jim Crow laws, we've got, hate groups and white supremacy. Some of this we've talked about just this week. The war on drugs and the populations of residents within our communities who are being targeted and sent to prisons in an industrial complex there is challenging, to say the least. So mass incarceration, a school to prison pipeline. I even usually, expand this to say a parole to prison pipeline, just kind of a prison to prison pipeline based on our underinvestment in programs to adjust recidivism. There are some significant items that legislators have talked about and proposed regarding kind of banning the box, which prohibits the inclusion of a have you served in time, have you been convicted for a crime in initial job applications and things, opportunities that are being lost because we haven't fully invested and eradicated some of these inequities and injustices in our justice system. Some of those are budgetary that we'll talk about, and some of those are just legislative that perhaps won't be as much a portion of this budget equity conversation now or in kind of years going forward as they are just please continue to engage in this work and engage with this community and others. And then again, biased court sentencing guidelines have played their part in continuing to unfortunately feed our prison systems. So the governor's budget has done some great work. Again, the legalization of adult use recreational marijuana, and again, some work there around how we address those who are currently serving because of small amounts of is very, very important. Community policing programs, such as those to kind of introduce children to police. These, to me, are very important. The governor really continues to highlight those, which I'm appreciative of, increasing the number of law enforcement agencies and encouraging them to be accredited. So it's, I don't want to call it inside baseball, but accreditations at least enforce a level of training and kind of work at the local police level that doesn't eradicate bias, but it really does, in many ways, it helps. It's a fairly expensive program, but I'm encouraged by the governors continuing to push that. And then, we kind of get into some of the real meat and potatoes of some of the rest of this around reducing and in some ways eliminating cash bail, the establishment of a state office of indigent defense, or basically a state public defender's office. $50,000 per year was proposed in the governor's budget in compensation for the wrongly convicted. And then money to expand legal service offerings for low-income individuals and families. Some great work. Again, the governor's budget, I'm personally fairly happy with. I think he went out and really put some good work to paper, and I'm happy to continue to support it. So some of those interest areas within the Legislative Black Caucus include, again, establishing a state office of indigent defense. This is crucial. I know it's actually one of the important projects for, I'll call it, legislator Rep. Joanna McClinton, and I'm so happy that she's doing great work as the minority leader. But this is one that's actually got some really big advocates on both sides of the aisle in both chambers. So it's there's some bipartisan and bicameral work around establishing a state office of indigent defense, and I think that would be crucial. Compensation for wrongly convicted is another one of those areas where we need to make sure that we are not just trying to address the wrongs of kind of civil asset forfeiture in some of the ways that we're able to, that the justice system has robbed individuals of wealth, but at least provided compensation for them. Again, this could be justice, this could be in wealth. Bail and court reform, court fee reform. So again, looking to eliminate cash bail, looking at how we can identify ways to make just court fees and filing fees compensated, free, oftentimes at least indexed based on income, and also gun violence prevention grants. So continuing to look at ways that we can just try and pull guns off the streets, try and address just the health impacts and the justice impacts of gun violence. How can we invest in our communities? It's so crucial.
Representative Nelson, we did have one more question going back to education.
Yep.
Sheila from Erie asked, why is there an illiteracy problem in my school district? Minority students are exiting with a letter of completion rather than a diploma, which I think gets at some of the inequities you were talking about. And then we should wrap up after that.
Yep. So there is some significant work. So I think that, having a whole nother one of these to address education and trying to address education gaps would be great. One of the areas, if I, just getting back on kind of how the dollars are being appropriated, that I would encourage the questioner, and I forgot the name. Levana, can you help me with that?
Oh, Sheila.
So some of the funds that are coming into the state from the federal, CARES, COVID stimulus support are going to go towards summer programs and addressing kind of educational loss prevention. So there are some dollars that are coming into our school districts that are specifically not tied to okay, well, how do we create great programs for those who are really flourishing, but how do we address learning loss? And how do we make sure that our students are able to, get what they need if they've been falling behind? It doesn't answer, all of your question. That's not going to be how we no longer have illiteracy in Pennsylvania. But at least it's one of those areas that, as we think about the budget, is an area that's topical, that's pertinent, and that some of that will be decided at the local level. So check with your school board, Sheila.
The other place we can invest is in adult education, adult basic education, which there are several programs across adult continuing education around literacy and basic math and other skill sets, so that those who came from an educational background in a school district that didn't prepare them, or for whatever reason, English is a second language, maybe we can prepare them for entry into the workforce and address some of those literacy skills that were lost in previous education systems.
So thank you both. This has been really informative and so helpful in thinking about what feedback you need in order to move forward and what all of us can do as advocates. So I really appreciate you both being here and taking such an in-depth look at this. We appreciate everyone who attended today and all of your attention. We've had almost 50 people this whole time hanging in with us. So thank you all. Please make sure to give us your thoughts on the Whova app. And if you missed any part of this workshop session or interested in what was presented in other workshops, video recordings will all be available and all of the slides will be available on the Whova app later this afternoon. So thank you again. This was really wonderful. Everyone go have a great day.
Thank you. And
Thank
thank you
you.
for your partnership in this work. So thank you guys to the team.
Thank you. Everyone have a great day.